Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the January meeting of the Clean Transit Enterprise Board. Give us 1 second here while we make sure that we've got a quorum. Yep, it looks like we do have a quorum, Mr. Chair. So we can go ahead and get started whenever you're ready.
All right. Hi, everyone. Happy New Year. It's our first meeting since 2022. It's good to see you all. I'm going to start the meeting with a roll call. So let's start with Director Trowbridge.
Here.
Hi.
Hi.
Director Block.
Here.
Director Garcia.
Here.
Director Jones.
Here.
Director Coffin. Director Coffin.
Here.
Hi, thanks.
Sorry, my
Director-
audio just.
All good, yeah. Director Blinn.
Here.
Director Takushi.
Here.
Director Averill.
Everybody.
All right, we've got full attendance. Fantastic. Let's see. Here's a look at the agenda for today's meeting. First up is to approve the minutes from our last meeting, which was November 9th, 2022. Is there any discussion on those meeting minutes? Okay, if not, I'll make a motion to approve those meeting minutes. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
Okay, all those in favor say aye.
Hi.
Aye. Opposed say nay. And any abstentions? Okay, meeting minutes are approved. Next on the agenda, we have an enterprise financial update from Kay and Celeste. So I'll hand it over to you all.
Hello, good afternoon. This is Kay. And in your packet was the budget to actual statement for the CTE funds through December. And as you can see that most of the expenses are related to staff time and attorney general fees, and also that the TC loan was paid off as well. And when it comes to the retail delivery fee, we have collected approximately 4.6 million. And that's roughly half of what we budgeted for. And from here, I'll let Celeste take over for the next slide regarding the retail delivery fee versus the projected or the forecasted amounts.
I don't see Celeste on the line yet. Would you be able to cover this one as well, Kay?
Sure. Sorry, I thought she was here, so I apologize. So as you can see from the forecasted versus the actual to revenue, we're pretty much collecting what we had forecasted. December, there was a little more of a variance, but overall, we're basically on par with the forecasts. Are there any questions from the board?
So quick question. It looks like we're 1 month in the rear from sales to collection, correct?
Correct, yes. So because it takes basically to get to us, the transactions are in the rear from when they get to us.
Great. Thank you, Kay.
Mm-hmm. Any more questions? All right, I think we're good.
All right, thank you, Kay. Next on the agenda is a program administrator update from Kay Kelly.
Thank you, Matt. We can go to the next slide. So just wanted to put on your radar a couple things that are upcoming. I believe we do need to meet in February because we'll need to approve a final budget. We are also anticipating any day now some correspondence from the Department of Revenue regarding the annual Clean Transit retail delivery fee adjustments for inflation. That was kind of baked into the fee that there will be annual adjustments for inflation, and that each of the enterprise boards would need to notify the Department of Revenue of our intention to adjust for inflation on an annual basis and let them know, I believe, by March 15th. So we have not received that correspondence yet. We were wondering if we might be able to get it onto the agenda for this month, but it will likely be in a February meeting. And again, we would need to notify them of our intention to adjust by March 15th. So just a couple things that will be coming up at the next meeting. And then in terms of what's on tap for us today, we have really just a couple of remaining items to decide upon prior to being able to issue any funding opportunities for the Clean Transit Enterprise. As you just heard, we have a little over $4 million in revenue, and we want to make sure that we're putting those funds to good use and getting them out on the streets, so to speak, so that we can be fulfilling our mission to get more clean transit vehicles out on the roads. So the last couple of things that we're going to be working through today, project scoring criteria related to match structure, match relief, and an equity approach. So we've been having iterative conversations on this for the last several months. We feel like we're close to a final recommendation on these. We're looking for the board's discussion and input, and it's our intention that we would bring that final decision to you in February. And that would be kind of the last thing what we would need before we were able to kind of draft application materials and again include those in an upcoming funding opportunity. And then we're also going to start talking about data reporting requirements. Sina Zen on our team has kind of formed a working group to talk through some of the data requirements, and she'll give a presentation on that. We also have a recommendation on that that we can bring to the board in February, depending on how the conversation goes today and if the board is in agreement with what the working group suggested. And I think that's all from me. So we can, if there are any questions for me, otherwise we can just start diving into these topics. All right, hearing none, I'll hand it back to you, Mr. Chair.
All right, thank you. Okay, so now we have Michael King and Amber Blake from CDOT, and they're going to lead us through a discussion on the CTE equity approach.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I will start with a little bit of the recap of this conversation since it's been a few months. You might recall that during the development of the 10-year plan for the Clean Transit Enterprise, we identified that there was a need for a grantee match strategy that would account for different types of projects and also different types of entities, agencies that might be receiving funds. This is to ensure that we don't end up in a situation where the agencies that have available cash match are more competitive for all the funding, and agencies that have more financial restrictions are left out of the participation in the CTE programs. We talked at one point about adopting a similar model to what CDOT's Multimodal and Mitigation Options Fund uses, which is a formula approach, tries to account for both the available resources for a local government as well as the strain that may be on those resources based on local need. Next slide, please. However, in discussing that option during the July CTE board meeting, Michael Snow from DTD came to us. We talked through some of the elements of that formula, and we also identified that there was some challenge with it because the the way that transit agencies operate and the geography that they operate in doesn't line up very neatly with counties and municipalities. And some of the metrics that the DTD folks use don't apply as well to transit agencies. So following some further discussion in October, the CTE board indicated a preference for a more simplified approach that would have more standard match percentages rather than a complicated formula, but it would also include the option for case-by-case match relief. And that would be the way that we would make sure that the standard match requirements would not preclude anyone from participating in the grants. In November, we brought some options to the board to look at for what those standard match percentages would be. And we got some general support, but also were encouraged by the board members to refine the match levels, and particularly to focus on improving the match level or the incentive levels for vehicle grants that include scrapping of an existing ICE vehicle. That is not required in the CTE 10-year plan, but it's something that the board wanted to encourage through an added incentive. Next slide, please. So this is the updated suggestion proposal for the board to consider related to the match levels. We'll start at the top with the planning, infrastructure, and facilities categories of projects. This is more or less unchanged from last month. So there would be a standard match requirement, and then the potential match for those agencies that seek and are granted some form of match relief from the board. Standard match percentage for planning would be 10%. For infrastructure, charging and fueling would be 20%. And for facilities, it would be 50%. The reason that those are different is because we want to especially encourage planning in the early years. The 20% is kind of a standard rate that we tend to see for most project types that have federal grants. And the 50% for facilities is because those projects are likely to be more expensive. And so requiring a larger grantee match make sure that we don't expend all the funds in that one category too quickly. And then you can see that the match requirements with relief in all cases are about 50% of the standard match requirement. In the fourth project category, which is vehicles, it's a little bit different because the way that we approach this is based on the incremental cost of a zero emission transit vehicle as compared to a conventionally fueled vehicle, diesel or gasoline. And so rather than talking about match, it's more about what percentage of that incremental cost does the grant cover. The proposed standard incentive level is 100% of the incremental cost. So essentially, a grantee would have the cost of their zero emission vehicle would be effectively the same as the cost of their conventionally fueled replacement, because the difference is being 100% covered by the grant. Then for those grantees who are seeking a replacement but also scrapping an existing vehicle, they would get potentially a 25% bonus above that 100% incremental cost. And then finally, for those that are seeking a relief request, could also be eligible for that 25% bonus. And those could be stackable on one another. So if someone was seeking match relief as well as planning to scrap a vehicle, they could potentially get 150% of the incremental cost of a vehicle. There would still, at 150%, in most cases, there would still be remaining match required. That would not cover the full price because it tends to be about 2 to 1 right now. So we think that this is an appropriate level of incentive that would motivate folks who might be on the fence about going to a zero emission vehicle. This would negate that cost. It would also encourage those who have a vehicle to scrap to do so, if that's possible for them, but it would not require it. And it would also have some room for relief requests for those agencies that need that. So I will pause here and happy to take any questions, comments, or feedback on any of the proposed match and incentive levels here.
Question, do we have a definition for scrapping?
There is a definition of scrapping, which we have from the Volkswagen settlement. We could adopt the same or we could adjust it. In the Volkswagen settlement, scrapping, it requires the drilling of a 3-inch hole through the engine block of a vehicle and or the cutting of the frame rails entirely in half. So essentially ensuring that the vehicle becomes unusable permanently. I can say that in some cases, Volkswagen settlement grantees have found it easier and more cost effective to simply crush the entire vehicle rather than do those very specific cuts and drills. But effectively, that is the same result, that the vehicle becomes unusable permanently. Anything on the vehicle apart from the engine and the frame can be salvaged. So if you want to take the seats off, if you want to take any equipment off, that's all allowable under Volkswagen. So we could adopt a consistent definition for this program. It might be easiest for the grantees, but we could also consider a different one.
Thank you, Michael. I think we should discuss it at least and see what might be the temperature of the board on this definition.
Director Averill, did you have a comment or question?
Yeah, I guess I'm just kind of trying to game out how this works from an applicant's point of view. You know me, I get stuck on details. I try not to drag us down the weeds too far here, but so is the idea here that if we're getting 100% of the incremental cost, there's still a certain proportion of a vehicle replacement project that's not funded? Is the idea that we would bundle CTE grants along with the DTR grant through the 5311 program or 5339 program to make the vehicle replacement whole? Is that something that's been talked about internally? And as a follow-up to that, is that something that we could see handled in one contract, or is it 2 contracts, 2 reimbursement processes, like all that kind of stuff? I guess just the practical nature of how this plays out, because frankly, for a lot of smaller agencies, more contracts and more reporting is a disincentive. You know, it becomes a little bit more daunting to do that financial planning and all that kind of stuff for sort of a bundled award, if you will. So can you explain to me the internal thought process on that a little bit, please?
Certainly. So what we have seen through the Volkswagen settlement, which is our closest analogy to this, some applicants will win a settlement award, which covers the incremental cost, and they will pay the remaining amount of the vehicle without a second grant. It generally works out to be about 50-50. So that is one option. However, as you allude to, many applicants will simultaneously pursue a state grant award, and then the 2 grants together make the project whole. And then a third option, which is slightly different, is that sometimes we see applicants will come in for the Volkswagen settlement award. Once that is secured, they will use that to be more competitive in pursuing a federal grant that the state of Colorado does not directly make the decisions on. That third situation is one that, of course, we like to encourage, because that means that we're actually adding to the total pot of transit electrification funds in Colorado. The second option, where you have both in this case, a CTE grant plus a DTR grant, it is a little bit of extra logistical work to do 2 grant applications. However, we have talked with DTR about the option in the future that if someone is awarded both of those, that we could put it on a single contract to minimize the kind of reporting and reimbursement burden, but there still would be 2 applications on the front end. We hope to minimize that as much as possible in the process. We think that the advantage of maintaining that sort of incremental 50-50 is that it allows us to encourage agencies to pursue other outside funding, either their own funding that they have if they're in that situation, or federal funding that we don't have access to without a successful award. So there is some extra logistical challenge there, but we think that it can be minimized and that it's worth it to bring extra funds into the state over the long term.
Yeah, I agree. I'm always a big fan of seeing more federal money come into the state without spending ours first. So I appreciate that. And I guess I'll just trust that it ends up being, you know, as seamless as possible, as seamless as CDOT contracting can possibly be. I think that'd be great. So thanks for the explanation. I appreciate it, Mike.
I will jump in. Yeah, I just looking at the match percentages, and I wonder if others on the call have comments on the numbers. I guess the one for me, and I don't know if I have a strong opinion on this, but on the planning side, you know, I think it is a high priority for the CTE that we do the work and we lay the groundwork for the full fleet transition. And so I'm a big fan of the planning. I wonder if it does make sense to keep, you know, the 5% in there, or to reduce it to 0, because we would like to see transit agencies around the state do the planning work, and I'm not sure they have the money set aside for it. If we did reduce that to 0 and just offered planning assistance and funding, you know, it would be a relatively low cost, it seemed, to the enterprise. So that one just kind of stuck out to me, and I wonder if others have an opinion about that, or the other percentages on infrastructure and facilities.
I can say on from the state perspective, I think that we try to avoid any 0% match situation because there's a belief that having the grantee have some financial commitment to the success of the project, even if it is very small, is important for the way that staff and leadership prioritize the effort. So, you know, the argument might be that if you had truly $0 grants, then the agencies receiving those would not treat it with the importance to have a successful project. However, of course, there could always be a situation in which an agency truly has no possible contribution, but is committed to the project. And so there could be a situation in which there is always a 0% match option underneath the 5% or the reduced match option that the board could authorize, but in only very convincing situations. That could be another approach to allow that flexibility, but without awarding too many 0 match awards.
To add a little bit of context to that, can the team clarify like what you would put forward as match? It's not necessarily just, you know, cold hard cash. It could be your staff time spent in meetings on the awards, your staff time spent kind of working with that entity who's doing the plan. So maybe not over and above typical budget, but just an allocation of existing resources toward the project. Can someone clarify that if I'm interpreting that correctly?
I'm not sure if the question is directed at me, but there is certainly an option for in-kind match in many state grant programs, which would include staff time, meeting space, other things like that. So yes, certainly that 5% or 10% or whatever the ultimate number ends up being could be provided through the contribution of the staff without having to have cash on hand. Director Jones, did you have a comment?
I do. Thank you for this analysis. I'm comfortable as far as the match requirements go. My beef, and I've brought this up before, is with the scrapping requirement. I understand and appreciate the thought behind it, but I, in my brain, still wonder and question whether or not it's more of a virtue signaling rather than an actual requirement that could translate into reduced emissions over time. Where my concern is there's still a market out there on the planet for mass transit vehicles that we are affecting with this possible requirement if people take advantage of it. And so scrapping a vehicle by damaging the engine inherently reduces the value of the asset. Doesn't mean that a transit agency wouldn't still choose to auction the vehicle. It just means whoever buys it at whatever its value is now charged with repairing the vehicle. And are they going to repair it in a way that it makes it electric, or are they just going to find another engine somewhere else? And they're going to do their cost benefit analysis in that. It just seems really weird to me to require a government agency to inherently reduce the value of an asset. I understand and appreciate that we're talking about reducing the value of an asset that produces emissions, but I don't know that we actually would, even by doing that we actually translate into a reduced demand in vehicles that produce greenhouse gas emissions. We just reduce the supply. And so I brought it up before, just wanted to bring it up again. I would love to see some research that actually says that by reducing the supply of these vehicles inherently translates into more low emission vehicles out there, or does it just require more folks to purchase new vehicles?
Director Garcia?
Thank you. So in following up that comment, I would support that. I'm kind of feeling that way as well. I'm wondering if there are any are there any levels for, say, certain emissions from certain buses that we could maybe track on that? So if there's really high polluting, nasty buses or equipment that we want off the road, that we could maybe target those for scrapping versus some other emissions level that might have a reuse elsewhere with a different transit need. I just throw that out there for thought, but I share similar ideas about the scrapping and the necessity for it.
I may ask Kay or Director Coffin to weigh in. I believe that typically pre-2009 model year vehicles are considered much more polluting than post, but I would ask if others know more about that than I do.
Director Coffin, I think you're closest to this issue. I'll let you speak.
Yeah, I think Mike, I think 2009 is considered the cutoff. And as far as the comments, Director Jones' comments about the concern, that, if an agency drills a hole in an engine block of a bus, what happens to the bus afterwards? I guess my understanding of existing grants that have a scrap requirement, like the VW program and EPA DERA grant, is I think there's a requirement that equipment or vehicle is out of service Like, so the grantee basically certifies or, signs a form saying as much. So, I mean, I'm open to the idea of retrofitting or upgrading a bus to be electric. Yeah, or, maybe possibly some hybrid options as well. Although electric is the zero emissions is the goal, but I guess I was under the impression that, that would be the case for this as well. But I guess as you were talking about before, I think, there seems to be some interest in discussion about the definition of scrapping. Yeah, I think I'll stop there.
I believe Director Averill had his hand raised.
Yeah, I just want to echo what Director Jones and Garcia have mentioned. I fundamentally kind of have some heartburn about scrapping in general. I believe that is prior to the VW program, it was never talked about as far as any other federal or state grants that scrapping would be a requirement of that. I think it's pretty unique to the VW settlement court order. And I think that in this day and age, like where we're at right now as an industry with supply chain issues and things like that, I guess there's sort of two ways to come down on this. If you make the assumption that anybody that comes in to replace a bus with CTE funds, that bus is going to be near its end of service life anyway, and it would likely go to the auction and not have much useful life, if any, at all. But there is a scenario here where people are trying to replace buses a little earlier because it makes sense because they're transitioning to an electric fleet. They want to do it all at once, or whatever the circumstances may be, that there is some useful life left in that vehicle, that old dirty diesel bus that another agency could make use of, because they can't get their hands on other buses right now because of supply chain and other things, or maybe it's just a question of funding. I guess I would argue that even having a dirty bus still rolling on the street, if it's full, has a net air quality benefit, right? And that's kind of where I keep coming down on this stuff. I want to see buses driven into the ground, literally. Like I want to see them eke every inch of every bit of life they can out of them, within reason. So I think it's a little risky to incentivize scrapping vehicles, but particularly ones that may have some useful life left in them. If there was a way we could catch those and redistribute them as part of the grant award, or maybe if that is the case, they get a cost break by, passing that vehicle on to another agency somehow. We transfer vehicles amongst CDOT grant partners all the time. I'm working on a transfer on a cutaway out of Denver right now. So it's not uncommon. There's a methodology for that. I just would like us to think a little bit deeper about that before we decide to poke holes in engine blocks and send them off to pasture. Thanks.
Director Frommer.
Yeah, just to pile on, I agree with what's been said so far. I think the way I think about it too is, and I probably think about it differently if it was a light duty vehicle scrappage, since we don't need more cars on the road. But when it comes to transit, and if you look at like CDOT's greenhouse gas rule, for example, the modeling showing we need to like increase service by 70% by 2030, and that's going to take hundreds of new buses. And so, I do think it's probably not a good idea to take some of those transit vehicles out of service, since they do provide some air quality and climate benefit, maybe less than new zero emission vehicles. But all in all, we need to increase transit service statewide. So I would agree with that. I also, I'm interested in the conversation around repowering vehicles. And there's a group out of Loveland, their name's escaping me, but they do repowers of medium and heavy duty vehicles that I think might be interested. So I don't know if that's part of the conversation, but worth exploring.
Director Takushi.
Yeah, I just wanted to also jump into this conversation to echo several other comments on this. But yeah, I think from a greenhouse gas standpoint, I think having vehicles available is really important. And again, like it's already been said, to have people get into a bus rather than driving a single occupancy vehicle, even if it's diesel powered, does show a greenhouse gas benefit at a certain ridership level. So I do think it's important that it also sounds like there's maybe some questions around, I do have the question, can you still use the body of the vehicle? And I think Director Farmer, you're kind of getting at this, like, can you use an alternative way? It seems like there's a lot of flexibility within that, and we wouldn't want to take those bodies of vehicles out of, the supply and allow that to happen. So just wanted to add into the conversation. Thanks.
If I may, I'll just jump in and try to summarize a little bit. So when we initially talked with transit agencies back during 10-year plan development, I think it was pretty clear that scrappage was not popular. I think on conversations with the board, we felt like we should leave it in to potentially get some of those 2009, really oldest, dirtiest vehicles out. I think maybe what we're hearing is that the supply of transit buses generally the problem there has gotten even more acute, to where maybe the thing that pushed us to saying, yeah, I guess we could have scrappage, but not make it a requirement, make it optional. Maybe we're dialing back a little bit on that and saying, no, we actually need that vehicle on the road, because a full transit bus, even if it's an older transit bus, is better than not having that vehicle in service at all. So I think what we're showing on the screen here is it's optional, it's not required. What I think we're hearing from the board is that we don't even want it to be an additional bonus. Is that because if that's the recommendation of the board, I think we'd be comfortable removing the line that incentivizes the scrapping of an existing vehicle.
I'm personally comfortable with removing. I would want to do the cost benefit analysis. If I was a transit agency and 25% of the incremental cost was less than the value of the vehicle anyway, without scrapping it, then it's all comes down to the dollars and cents. But if 25% of the incremental cost is more than the value of the asset, then even if even if there is value left in the vehicle to provide trips for folks using transit, then I'd still scrap it because there's more money in it for me. So, and I don't know that's the value trade-off we want agencies to be making, and so that's why I would suggest just removing it.
All right, and I think we've had great discussion on this. I don't want to shut down the discussion, but I also know that we have a couple of other important topics on the agenda, including equity, which I think has gotten squeezed at the end of the agenda a couple times now. So with the board's concurrence, I think what we'll come back to you with for your official vote and blessing in February is these levels of match, but we would remove the incentive bonus for scrappage. And if folks feel otherwise, speak now. But I think it's probably good for us to move on to equity because there's a big conversation to occur in that section too. So, and appreciate the conversation.
Right.
I guess, I would be interested in hearing, from my perspective, I'm interested in the emission reductions, and it makes sense, that more people riding in a bus, rather than their own vehicle, is a great thing, for emission reductions. But I guess, can we look more deeply into, that potential outcome as a result of this program, rather than removing this voluntary incentive. I'm just not sure if that will actually happen. You know, I'm thinking back to when the gentleman from RTD presented to us, and he mentioned that, you know, they auction their old buses that I think are sold like out of state or out of country, and they would get like, I think he said $3,000 for them. So, you know, the emissions aren't happening in Colorado, but they're occurring somewhere else. And I guess the other piece of this too is I know CDOT has goals to get like the oldest, most unsafe buses off of the road as well. And I don't recall the numbers from one of your reports, but I believe there are quite a few of those buses out there. So I wonder if there's a way we can maybe try to, and, you know, without making this too complicated, you know, tie that together, looking at the ones that are like really the oldest, most unsafe buses. Or if we could look at this, you know, maybe a little more closely before removing the incentive altogether.
I would certainly be happy to look a little bit more into the details of what data and research is there on the specific emissions benefits of scrapping. Like, what can we expect to see in a scrapping versus non-scrapping scenario? And also follow up with you, Director Coffin, about the safety element. To be honest, I'm not really sure on either of those counts what we'll find, but I'm happy to look into it and bring any additional information that might be relevant to the group in the future if we find something that would potentially influence this this decision. With the chair's permission, I might move into the next section.
Yes, good discussion. Go ahead, Mike.
Thank you. All right, so this is another topic that we have been discussing for several months at this point and weighing different approaches of how to incorporate equity considerations into the grant programs. And there's sort of two parts of this conversation. One is, how do you determine which agencies or geographic areas of the state should be eligible for some sort of enhanced equity-based incentive? And then the second part of the conversation that we'll get to is, what do you then do from a programmatic standpoint to address that? And so here, focusing on the basis of determination, there are a couple of potential ways of going about this, and you can see the pros and cons of each. Starting with the geographic, this is something that is pretty common across state and federal grant programs, that there is some sort of mapping exercise determining which parts of a geography are eligible or in need of greater support for equity investments, and which are not, and then basing grant incentives or other things around that determination. This works in a lot of types of programs. One of the cons when we apply this to transit is that this is usually based on census data, and the boundaries of census tracts and other areas do not always align very neatly with the way that transit operates, either individual routes or entire service areas. So it is a bit of a clumsy match sometimes when you try to apply it to transit. It also does not account for the actual riders of a transit system who may or may not come from the geographic area that you are looking at with a geographic metric. So if we'll come back to the demographic and the agency focused in a second, but if we can go to the next slide, I can show in the state of Colorado, we have a number of different ways of measuring geographic equity need. Senate Bill 21260, which established this enterprise, is one of them. It has its own definition of what a disproportionately impacted community is. And there is a resulting map of which census tracts are included in that definition and which are not. That isn't obviously something that we want to account for in this enterprise because it is in the same piece of legislation that created the enterprise, but it is not the only tool in the state to make these determinations. The Department of Public Health and Environment has the Colorado EnviroScreen, which is another mapping tool that accounts for environmental justice and health issues in different geographies. There is also at the federal level, the Justice 40 approach, which uses similar but different inputs to make this determination geographically across the entire country and is directly connected to several of the grant programs in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, such as the NEVI program. And then shortly before the creation of the Clean Transit Enterprise, the Colorado Energy Office conducted an EV equity study, which itself made some determinations based on a lot of stakeholder engagement about what the Transportation Equity Index should show in Colorado. And so the question arises, what is the best way to pick between these options or to align these options, since they are all similar in their intent, similar in their inputs, but slightly different in the results? And the approach that the state has been taking for the Charge Ahead Colorado grant program and the NEVI program is to combine all four of them rather than trying to pick which one is best, to say that if you meet any of these definitions, and there's a fifth layer, which is tribal lands, if you meet any of those 5 definitions, you are eligible for an enhanced incentive in the Charge Ahead Colorado grant program, in the NEVI grant program, the DC Fast Charging Plazas grant program, and the like. So the goal there being consistency. If we go to the next slide, I'll illustrate sort of what this looks like on a mapping level. So this is a map that our colleagues at the Colorado Energy Office put together. And you can see on the left that you have different census tract areas that are highlighted in colors indicating, do they meet the definition of one of those 5? Do they meet the definition of 2 criteria, 3, potentially all 4 or 5 criteria if you include tribal areas? This is sort of a slightly zoomed in. This is not the entire state. This is sort of focused on the Front Range. If we go to the next slide, you'll see a version of this that is even more zoomed in on the Denver Metro. And so you can see that there are some areas that the Senate Bill 260 definition includes and none others. There are some where the NEVI definition is the only one that applies. And so rather than trying to tell folks that for program A, you have to look at the yellow areas only, and for program B, you have to look at the green areas only, and really confuse our applicants and stakeholders, the idea is that we combine all of them into a single layer, which is on the next slide. And that tells us every area in the state that is eligible for an enhanced incentive. So if we could go to that next slide, please. So the colors sort of flipped here, but the gray areas are all 5 layers combined into one. And this is what the Colorado Energy Office and CDOT are using in the Charge Ahead Colorado grant program, the NEVI grant program, and we expect to use in several more, so that it's one consistent binary, you're either enhanced incentive or you're not, and it's the same across every grant program. So the CTE could consider using this same definition for the geographic input on the CTE grant programs and say, rather than expecting a local community to understand multiple definitions and tailor their application to each one, we could maintain this consistency with the other state grant programs, and also I think likely, I don't know this for a fact, but likely with the other state enterprises who seem to be moving in a similar direction of one consistent enhanced incentive map that combines multiple different ways of measuring that. I will pause here if there are any questions or comments on this general approach. Director Frommer?
Yeah, just to clarify, and sorry if you covered this, but the idea that if your transit agency operates in any one of these census tracts or census blocks, you'd be eligible for the funding, or that the bus route that would be receiving the grant to electrify would be operating there?
Well, that is the thorny issue. Whatever geographic definition the CTE board chooses to adopt, there will then have to be that secondary conversation about if the project is not a single point on that geography, such as a vehicle, how do you apply this? Is it any overlap of the service area is enough to be considered in? Is it some percentage of the time that the vehicle is spending at least 50% of its time in such an area? I mean, you can imagine it could get very complicated very quickly. So right now, what we're asking is sort of, is this the right way to determine the geography? But then that subsequent question of then how do you apply that to a specific route or a entire service area is a little bit harder to pin down.
Yeah. Yeah, I would just be curious to see the list of transit agencies that would be eligible with this map. And, you know, if it is just a checkerboard in Grand Junction, like it would seem like the transit agency there would have a bus route that does operate in one of those census tracts. It's probably true for most of the state. So just to like gut check whether this makes sense, and or whether, you know, our equity definitions are so broad that they would apply to pretty much any transit agency in the state.
Director Block?
As a very small agency, you're looking at it, the less that we had to figure out where we were going to fit, the better we are. And if this is going to fall in line with what is being kind of called the standard now, I would prefer to see this use so we don't have to guess.
Other comments or feedback on this approach to mapping equity areas?
I think it's good. To echo Don's comment, it takes some of the guesswork out of it. I do like that Justice 40 tool. It some of the measures it incorporates make sense to me, like the transportation access and burden measure in particular is something that other stuff doesn't get at. And that's something that I think helps to answer some of that question, like when you're serving an area that's outside of your service area, not necessarily your home base, it incorporates some of those really telling characteristics about those other communities that you may end up serving that are outside of your service area. So I guess by definition, they're in the service area at that point, but again, not where our headquarters are. So yeah, I like that also because it's consistent, it's available to everybody. And then in the bigger picture, if I'm reading between the lines accurately with conversations at the federal level, this type of analysis is just going to become part and parcel to the federal, potentially become part and parcel to the federal grant award process as well. Not just the discretionary programs, but even the formula programs that CDOT administers. So I think if we can align ourselves with that, it'll be just less confusing for everybody down the road, whatever that looks like.
All right. Well, if I could ask Desiree to go back a few slides to the table that summarized one more, please. All right. So we talked a bit there about determining geographic eligibility. It sounds like there is some support for the idea of the combined sort of 5-layer map layer that is consistent with other state approaches. Putting on hold for a second the question of how you tell whether a transit agency is in or out. yet. The other two bases of determination that could be considered when we think about equity for transit projects is the demographics of the actual population that uses the service, which may or may not align neatly with the geographic location of that service. And then the agency itself. What is the agency's financial capacity to implement a project, to afford a project, which again, may or may not actually align with the demographic or geographic elements. So these are more challenging because there is not a clear metric that you would use for some of these. The data, when it comes to demographics, the data is inconsistent or sparse. The data may change over time and may not actually reflect need. Things like income or racial background may not actually align with whether or not the population is transit dependent. And then of course there are privacy concerns anytime you think about demographic data of riders. And perhaps from the most practical standpoint, there just doesn't seem to be consistent gathering of this data by most transit agencies in a way that we could compare apples to apples in a set of applications. Likewise, agency focused, there does not appear to be a single consistent metric for the financial capacity or staff expertise of an agency. So while some agencies may be better or worse equipped to quickly implement a new technology that has higher upfront costs, there doesn't appear to be an objective way that the state or the CTE could look at their data and make that determination. And so our recommendation is that rather than trying to figure out a formula or number or specific set of checkboxes for these, that in the CTE application process, there be space for a narrative description by the applicant of these types of issues, why they may impact their need for greater support for a project that would be coupled with the more straight ahead geographic determination of whether or not their service area is within that equity geography. So what we're proposing here is sort of a combination that there's a more straightforward, consistent, objective look based on geography as to whether an agency or an applicant is eligible, but that it also be coupled with a more subjective narrative description of them making the case for why other factors that are not easily quantifiable are important to their application. I'll pause here and request any feedback or questions on that suggestion.
I would support that, Michael. That sounds to me and feels to me pretty consistent with what we just saw with the latest round of 5339 applications. There was some numbers, some verifiable data that was included in those applications, as well as a narrative that gives us a chance to speak to the issues. So I would support that.
Hey, Mike, I guess I'll add some comments. First, going back to the last discussion point about the map, I like that kind of solution that was, or proposal that was presented. So agree with the previous comments about that. After the last meeting, I asked around within CDPHE about like how other programs and divisions are incorporating equity into their grants, and for the most part, the basis was geography. Seems like that's the common one. That's easiest to do. Some of the grants also have the option for the applicant to include a narrative and whatever relevant information on, how their project will help reduce impacts to those in the underserved communities. So like if it doesn't, they won't receive any points, but if there's a range, like 0 to 5 or something like that. So yeah, that was an idea. And then the last thing is I'm working with like using RMAP and ViraScreen to screen potential projects, like not related to transportation. And one thing, and I don't want to muddy the waters, but this will muddy things. One thing that we look at is like, should there be a kind of like a buffer area outside of the block group that the facility is located in, like, a mile or a 3-mile radius outside. So, I mean, that would potentially expand, the area. And I think the thinking is like, if a transit agency is located in a disproportionately impacted community, and if their routes kind of go through block groups that do meet that definition, or if they don't, if the neighboring block group is defined as a disproportionately impacted community, it might be like 500 feet away, so there's potential for, an impact or some relationship to the people who live in that community. So it's one of the difficult things about using map tools. Sometimes you really have to drill in and look at the specific communities. So just some ideas I want to throw out there.
Director Takushi.
Thank you. Yeah, I really appreciate this conversation, and I think I also agree that having both the combined map and having a narrative section makes sense. I think one of the things I wanted to ask is there an opportunity to provide an education piece as part of for the transit agency as they're applying to kind of look into, and perhaps it's Justice 40 or something. I know that for the greenhouse gas planning role, we are looking at some very sophisticated GIS mapping, and it gets pretty technical pretty quickly, and adding buffer zones, and there's a lot of expertise that's needed there. I think requiring that level of analysis would be too much for an application. However, I think there might be an opportunity just to provide that education of what are the benefits and burdens. So I'm just wondering if there would be an opportunity to include that as either part of the application or as part of the link or something, so that if an applicant wanted to learn more about what that meant, or how to, if an area is outside of a DI community, how they could serve better, would that be possible?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting idea. The way that the Charge Ahead Colorado grant program does it is, to your point about making it simple for applicants, it's basically you put in an address and it tells you you're in or you're out of the enhanced incentive area. So that's very straightforward if that's the level that the applicants want to stay at. But I do like the idea of providing additional tools and information about how a more in-depth analysis could be done in case they would like to learn that. I don't know if you're imagining that as part of the application process, or perhaps even a part of the eventual award, because I know that the federal, I believe that the latest round of 5339C grants from the FTA actually had a requirement of a minimum percentage of the grant funding that had to be used for workforce development. And I think that was intended to be more in terms of maintenance, retraining for folks that receive a vehicle, that they have to retrain their staff to use it. But there could potentially be an option as well here that sort of analysis be part of either a planning grant or maybe eventually another type of grant as an optional expense. So that's something I'd be happy to think through and talk with the directors in the future about how we could educate people at the same time that we give them tools for a quick and seamless application.
Thank you.
Mike, something else I was just going to flag, and I think you and I talked about this a while ago when CO was developing the charge ahead enhanced incentives, was the idea of having some sort of exemption process, or, you know, I think we know these mapping tools aren't always perfect or don't always capture every aspect of equity, and maybe the narrative portion gets at this already, sort of enabling agencies to talk about the riders that they serve and that kind of thing. But it's not something we've implemented in Charge Ahead yet. I think it's something we need to, but that just could be a good backstop for, you know, aspects of equity that we may not be considering with these definitions.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. You know, if you're looking just at the geographic mapping of which areas are or are not considered eligible, I believe that Xcel Energy has a similar mapping tool for their territory, but they also have a built-in appeals process for you know, if there's a geographic area that the folks there think that they should be counted as in, there is a process for them to request consideration and addition in the future. So something like that, or just having that be part of the narrative option to explain why perhaps the census data does not show you as having this need, but here's the explanation for why it actually exists despite what the census tells you. I think both of those would be options to make sure that there's always a sort of a pressure release valve for anyone that feels like the tool is not reflecting what they actually need. Well, in the interest of time, I'm hearing some general support for the combined approach here, and a couple great questions for us to refine for the next time. So I might ask Desiree if we can move forward through the maps that we already saw. Okay, so that was just sort of re-summarizing the same. So, okay, so now the second part of the conversation here is, once we have identified areas in need of greater support through the mapping and through the narrative factors that we discussed, what are we doing to actually give those folks extra support in their applications? And this is a slide that we used last month. Some options here are, you can decrease the match requirement for those eligible applicants. You can increase the funding through some sort of bonus structure. You can increase the application scoring so that they are more competitive than they would be otherwise when compared to other applicants. Or there was also the idea of a statewide target, where you're not really applying it to individual applications, but it's more in the aggregate. How are we doing overall across all programs over multiple years? Again, you see pros and cons. I won't read them all, but you know, each one has certain advantages and certain disadvantages in terms of how it actually meaningfully addresses the equity challenges that some applicants will have. And if you go to the next slide, Desiree, it's really just, it shows essentially that through the match structure that we described in our previous agenda topic, we already have this option for decreased match. That's already covered. There's already a bonus option for those that are seeking match relief. There is already, through the narrative that we just described, the potential for higher application scoring. So, you know, those eligible entities, whether it's by geography or by narrative, would be receiving a higher score in comparison to other applicants. And so in this sense, we've already feel like we've covered our bases relatively well in the way that we designed the incentive structure and the match structure. The last item, the statewide equity target, is something that was discussed last month. The board expressed interest in pursuing that. The challenge there is we don't feel like right now we have sufficient data to know what that target should be. And we do have many experts in the state that could help us understand what a good statewide equity target would look like. Some of them within CDOT itself, others at CDPHE and our partner agencies. So we wanted to recommend that the board consider perhaps some sort of ongoing conversation about that statewide equity target at a future meeting to refine exactly what we would like to see, and also to consider whether it would make sense to set that type of target after the programs begin, after there's some real world data about the actual applicants and the actual awards, so that we could measure a baseline and then set a target for future program years beyond year one. Because right now it's sort of hard to say what the target should be because we don't actually really know who our applicants are going to be until we do our first round of grants. So I will pause there and see if there's any feedback on the first three items and whether we've covered them in our existing match and match structure. And then the fourth item as to how we would like to proceed with a statewide equity target, either now or in the future.
Hey, Mike, this is Rick. I guess, would there be any downside to looking into this now?
If you mean now as in before the first round, or do you mean now as in today?
Oh, no, before the first round, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Well, so I'll just say, in terms of why we're not trying to address this today is partially because we haven't had time to pull together our kind of agency experts. But yeah, I mean, certainly we could consider setting an initial target before the first round. I guess the challenge with that is if you don't have real world data yet, you don't necessarily know if your target is realistic. And then you might end up either easily surpassing your target in the first round or realizing that your target is way too ambitious compared to what is actually likely. And in either of those cases, you then might have to adjust your target in year 2 or ongoing. So, it's sort of a situation where if you do it earlier, you might have to continually do it again in the future. Whereas if you wait, maybe you get it quote unquote right the first time, but I don't think there's a major downside. Other directors, any feedback on whether a statewide equity target or goal is something that would be valuable in the short term or in the longer term?
I'll chime in real quick, and I'm comfortable with the way that you've shared this information and agree that I'm fine with the long-term approach as we learn from the types of applications that come in. Just knowing that we have an equity component to this conversation, as far as I'm concerned, is gets us far enough. But if there are things that we can learn in the near term based on work that's happening with other similar enterprises, great, but not a necessity to get this nailed down before we start accepting applications from my perspective.
I'll just jump in. I think I'd like to better understand what that might look like. So perhaps in a future meeting, sounds like my end, and I think I just froze, but just to understand better what that would look like, but I'd be okay having it further out as well.
Thank you. Director Block?
I'm kind of the same mind if we can get it nailed down relatively quickly, but I think it's going to change as we go. If we can push that out till we get that real world data, in my opinion, that's a better way to go.
Thank you. I will note that I think Director Averill had a thumbs up emoji at one point. So correct me if I'm wrong, Director, but it sounded like an endorsement as well.
Yes, that was an endorsement. Thanks, Mike.
Yeah, I think I'd be open to waiting. I think if we felt like we wanted to just put something out there aspirationally and know that we may need to adjust it, I think we could say something along the lines of Justice 40. I feel like that's a target that's out there and being applied in a number of different places. So I would feel comfortable with that as well. Obviously, having data is a good thing, but we also know we're going to be getting a lot of money out the door, in the next year, 2 years. So maybe we do want to set our aspirations somewhere.
Yeah, and I think we could get into a position where we're letting the perfect be the enemy of the good if we don't, just I think start moving forward with, several elements of equity that we've described here, and then kind of working toward those targets. And we can certainly include that in a resolution for the board that this is our starting point, and that we'll be looking more closely at equity using data from initial rounds, and have that goal to establish something that might be more statewide as we're getting more experience.
I think that sounds good. I am really excited about this, but I'm also nervous that we don't know what we don't know in a lot of these situations. So would like the opportunity to learn as we go.
So I guess the last thing I would ask then would be, does the group have a sense of what that percentage would be if there is a statewide equity target? And just to be clear about how we're defining this, is there a target percentage of applications or grantees, I guess is better to say than applications, grantees who are eligible for an enhanced incentive based either on the geography that we discussed or the narrative? And if so, like what would that percentage be? Kelly mentioned, or Director Blinn, excuse me, mentioned Justice 40. That is a federal target, 40% of benefit going to disproportionately impacted communities. But the board could suggest any percentage or other way of measuring a statewide target.
I think it's also okay to say we don't have enough information to know, and maybe that feeds into we need to do the research and spend a longer time in the process. So before we set a numeric goal. not hearing any strong opinions or any opinions on that. So, so Mike, do you feel like we have sufficient info to move forward for the resolution on this one for next month as well?
I do. If any of the directors want to disagree with that, but I feel like based on our conversations today on both the match levels and the equity approach, we have enough to develop 2 resolutions for your vote in February. And then, of course, understanding that all of these will be open to future revision as we get into the programs and continue meeting and refining over the years.
All right, thanks, Mike, and thanks for all your hard work on this. I am taking over as MC of the meeting. Director Fromer had another commitment he had to run to. We do have 2 more things on the agenda, and I think next up we've got data reporting, and that's with Mike and Sina. So I'll hand it over to you guys.
I'll just give a quick introduction that I asked Sina to look at this question of what is the appropriate data reporting requirement for grantees in the CTE based on some existing examples out there. And she developed a group to look at that question, and she's going to share her process and her recommendations with us today. Sina?
Thanks, Mike, and thanks, Kay. So just a bit of a background. Last October, we formed a working group with experts from CDOT's DTR, CDPHE, DO, and NREL to explore the question of what vehicle and or charter data should grantee transit agencies be required to report the CT on a regular basis. So some of the options that the working group looked at or considered include requiring identical data reporting requirements that is similar to the National Transit Database, NTD. And then, another option is requiring data reporting requirements similar to those of the Volkswagen settlement program. Or we also looked at what other best practices from other transit agencies. And for the 4th option we also looked at is just requiring all data set that they're collecting. Based on our first discussion, the working group kind of decided, the major takeaway is that how do we define success of the program, and what data do we need to show that? And we wanted to collect basic data that is set up for CTA and not overburden agencies in the data collection process. So from that, we went to the Colorado Electric Vehicle Coalition CVC Transit subgroup to solicit feedback. After all, they are going to be the ones who will be applying for the CT funds. So discussion with our transit agencies, we found out that there are already a lot of built-in telematics on their vehicles. And then these platforms include automated reporting that could be easily submitted on a recurring basis. However, we did have some concerns from smaller rural agencies that additional staff time may be required for this robust data collection. And Desiree, would you mind going to the next slide, please? So this slide just shows some of the response from our transit agencies on the 3 main questions that we asked them. First one was what vehicle and our charger data should grantee transit agencies be required to report to the CTE on a regular basis. The summary of that is that agencies just want us to collect basic usage data so that we're not requiring additional staff time for data collection process, aggregating the data, or sometimes maybe extra fees to get the platform. And then a second question we asked our transit agencies is what vehicle and charger telematics are already being collected. This is a question for transit agencies that are already operating e-buses, and the response include energy use, miles and hours driven, regeneration rate, diesel saved, CO2 avoided, fleet utilization, and cost of maintenance, among others. And then the last question we asked was, how often should data be reported? And our response on its recommended annual reporting. And I think that's similar to what NTD is requiring. So want to be more in line with that. And so after the feedback we heard from the CVC transit subgroup, we went back to our working group based on these information. And what the working group, the consensus was to collect data that will be used to inform program design and to be able to quantify GHG emissions reduction, but also putting into equity implications and not to overburden smaller agencies with additional staff time. Next slide, please, Nazari. So yeah, the main considerations and the recommendations include, we want transit agencies to be responsible for reporting energy usage and miles driven in ZEVs funded through the CTE. So some of the basic requirements, and then optionally, they could also report all of their onboard telematics just for like if additional information to help the state with ZEV transition planning. Or like really dark here. Yeah, and that is basically a summary of the process of our working group and how we came to this recommendation. And I'll turn it over to Mike for the discussion portion. Happy to answer any questions. And if anyone in the board have any recommendations on other data sets that you want us to look at, I could bring it back to the working group and explore other options. Thanks.
Thank you, Sina. So any feedback, comments or questions from the board? I see a thumbs up from Director Averill.
Yeah, I meant to raise my hand, so I'll do that now too. I guess I have a question here. That last bullet point, it being optional for agencies to share their onboard telematics. Why would that be an option and not a requirement? I guess it's a push of a button. It's a report that's spit out of whatever software management system they're using. And I think it would be like to the point there, it's incredibly valuable information for other agencies that are considering going electric. I guess it's nice to say it's optional, but boy, if they don't want to share that, that's a problem in my mind. I completely rely on my colleagues around the state for this type of information. Granted, I pick up the phone and call them and I usually get it, but I don't know why it wouldn't just be a requirement. Without being too heavy-handed, of course, I guess that's probably the flip side of it, but just kind of wondering about the utility of that.
Yeah, I think one of the concern was since if we're going to do yearly reporting, there might be additional staff time to aggregate those data per like monthly, and just rural agencies usually don't have a lot of staff, so that might be a barrier for them. So we just wanted to make it as like simple and easy as possible. So
yeah, I can get that. I just think it's real world information. It's not theoretical. It's not modeled as part of an analysis, right? It's like real feedback about how these things are working, and particularly in the more challenging environments of the resort areas. I just encourage. I guess I've been lucky all these years. People sharing all kinds of information with me, but I'll leave it alone. I was just kind of curious how that came to be. Thanks.
I see 3 hands, and I apologize. I don't know which order they were raised in, so I will start with Director Trowbridge, please.
Okay, well, I would agree with that about it being optional. I think this is really important information, but I wonder if instead of putting that on agencies, we could also put that on the manufacturers, because the manufacturers are tracking these buses as closely as the agencies are in most cases. So I wonder if there's a way to open that up to optional for agencies, or if it's too much of a burden, we put it on the manufacturers or something like that, just so that we are gathering as much information as we can.
So I guess my initial reaction to that is that if there is a grant agreement between the CTE and the agency, there is a mechanism to require that sort of thing. However, I don't know that the CTE would not have an agreement directly with the manufacturer, so I'm not sure we could enforce that. However, there might be a way that the agency in their procurement passes that requirement along. So
Yeah,
that's one where the
that's what we've seen
details
in other
might have to
places.
be, yeah. Okay. Can we go next to Director Block?
So I have to agree with David. Most transit people are very giving with their information. Pretty much all you have to do is call and ask for it. I like the idea of the NTD. We have to do that anyway, whether we like it or not. So everybody's used to collecting that information already. I also have a question as to why onboard telematics would be optional. In my little mind, that's a download something from the vehicle and print it, and there it is. I don't see that taking much more time or effort, but I would like to say thank you to the working group for recognizing that smaller agencies are a lot of times 1 or 2 people, and it is difficult to get a lot of information quickly. So I just wanted to say thank you for that.
Director Garcia?
Thank you. With the main target being able to measure greenhouse gas emissions, I'm just wondering if Director Takushi has any suggestion on data that might help that effort now and into the future.
Thanks, Director. I can respond. I mean, I think, yeah, telematics would probably be the most accurate information that we could achieve. Although, again, we can probably make some assumptions based on what's in the required elements here as well. But we would have the better information having real world information. Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think if that's beneficial, we should require it then. We need all the help we can to make sure we're hitting those emission goals that we're shooting for. So data is going to be key.
Sina, can you clarify, or someone in the transit space, can you clarify that all transit agencies do have telematics, or would there be situations where a transit agency wouldn't have telematics and not be able to do that, download, print, send a file scenario?
I think based on my understanding, it depends on the vehicle manufacturer. They have different telematics on their platform. So I will explore more on the different manufacturers and see what kind of basic data are common for all of those. And then maybe in the next meeting, get back to the board on that.
Yeah, I don't know if perhaps one of our colleagues from DTR could weigh in on this as well, but is it right to assume that the telematics system is more based on the vehicle than being agency-wide? So for instance, is it safe to assume that any new zero-emission vehicle being purchased through this grant program is likely to have telematics, even if the rest of the agency fleet does or does not? Or am I misunderstanding? Is it all or nothing from an agency level?
Unfortunately, Mike, I'm not well versed enough in exactly what that's going to look like to answer that question. I don't know if anyone else on this call is, but I don't see anyone with fleet on here.
Okay. We can certainly look into that and get back to the group, because it seems that if the only barrier is whether or not it's included in the purchase of the vehicle, we could quite easily make that a requirement of any grant that the grantee include telematics in their purchase, and then the barrier, the burden is only the reporting of that data. if it involves requiring a transit agency to develop an entire new data tracking and reporting system in order to get one vehicle, then obviously that could present a significant barrier to participation. So we will get to the bottom of that and make a recommendation next month accordingly. I see a comment from Director Jones.
Thank you. So I mean, data is so super important to this work in the sense of making sure that we do a good job of reporting out about all the benefits that this work is going to translate into over time. And I'm wondering and hoping that any transit agency that's developed a plan for converting to electric vehicles has included a data measure component to that. So I'm wondering if in our support of agencies developing their transition plans, that we communicate the data collection approach should be included in those plans. And that's what we look to as far as the measures that once they start actually building infrastructure and purchasing vehicles, that they refer back to their transition plan for the guidance here. And I think it's really important, though, that we have some consistency between how agencies are collecting data so that we can then easily translate it into measuring the effects of these particular funds. But again, I wonder if there's a way to tie it back to the plans that we're presumably going to help fund in this as well.
Yeah, I think that's a good suggestion, because it ties this stage of the project back to the other activities of the CTE. So yeah, I think that with this feedback, we're hearing that we should consider requiring telematics reporting, but also get a better understanding of what burden that might create for transit agencies, if any. And then also make sure that data collection and reporting is something that is baked into every stage of the project and the agency planning development. In the interest of time, I think we might pass it back to Kay for the last couple agenda topics.
Yeah. And just to double check, Director Trowbridge, I think your hand might still be up from prior, but do you have anything else to add? Okay, good. So next on the list is the CTE funding opportunity announcement schedule. As we mentioned, we've got about $4 million in our account right now, and we are closing in on the final decisions that would allow us to put together the application. So I'll pass it to Amber to tell you what the schedule could look like.
Thank you, Desiree. So what we are looking at for a schedule for the upcoming NOFA is that the grant, the super call NOFA, so this will be a notice of funding availability to be released in April of this year, likely towards the latter part of the month. The NOFA will include all of these CTE funds as well as the additional funds. The deadlines for each of those applications will be staggered, so it's not going to be everything due at once. All of that will be listed out in the NOFA. Once the NOFA is released, it will be available on DTR's website, and I've included that here so you have it with the presentation that's in your packet. And we will bring forward more information as we have refinement on dates, etc., so that we can answer further questions and make sure that you're in the loop so you can be ready to come in for these funds and we can get some new electric fleet out there on the road.
Any questions for Amber? Great. Well, I'm excited. It was almost exactly a year ago today that we had our first meeting, and to be in a position where we're getting prepared to put funding out, I think is a pretty exciting place to be. Director Garcia.
Thank you. Amber, quick question. So are you going to project revenues forward as part of your your award process, or are you just looking to award what we collect up to a certain date?
Can you repeat that? I don't think I understood the question.
So in your NOFA, you're gonna, I would think theoretically state you have $4 million available to award, or are you gonna project revenues further out and work on getting those dollars out as the process continues? I'm just wondering how.
Oh, yeah, that's a great question, Commissioner Garcia. So the way that we have typically, how we're planning to do our NOFA, I should say, is to release the amount of funding that we have available for this year's call. And then we can continue having the discussion. So if all of the funds aren't applied for and awarded from this year, then next year, any remaining funds from this year would carry forward and be available in the next year's call for project. Does that answer your question?
So it's for the full year. So with our revenue projections that we saw earlier, they're higher than expected for the most part. But are you looking to the end of the year, December 31, with funding projections out that far?
I don't know if we have looked that far. Kay and Mike, do you know what that number is going to be?
Or maybe it's the state's fiscal year. I just was assuming there.
Yeah, so in the fiscal year 22-23, so state fiscal year July 1 to June 30th, we've predicted about $8.2 million in revenue for the Clean Transit Enterprise, and then we've said about 6.8 million of that would go into our programmed funds. I would assume that we would be talking about programming that $6.8 million. And, you know, funding selections. I don't want to speak for DTR about when funding selections would happen for any of the pools of money, but I don't imagine we would be short that amount. We wouldn't have at least that amount available at the time that the decisions were made.
And the decisions, like Kate mentioned, so we're still working on those calendars for when decisions will be made. So there will be an anticipated cycle within that NOFA that'll say, you know, when you get it in April, it'll say, okay, now this call for projects is open. The CTE applications are due on this day. It's anticipated that we will be making award notifications within X period of time. So that, and that's what I mean by staggered, because the operating for FTA it will be on a different schedule than the capital projects.
Great, thank you.
Other questions or clarifications on this?
Yes, Kay, this is Kay. Just to clarify a comment made by Amber. One thing we have to be careful of is CTE's funds are not continuously appropriated, so they do not automatically roll from year to year. So we need to keep that in mind when we do our budget and when we do talk about crossing fiscal years.
Thank you, Kay.
One other question, do we have percentages of funding for planning, infrastructure, and what was the last one, facilities?
Yes, so we kind of outlined that in the 10-year plan, but we also said that that we would be open to those thresholds being based on the applications that we get, because you know, we don't have an entirely accurate crystal ball. We're not guessing that, but we said we anticipated about X% to each of those different things, but also that we wouldn't hold ourselves strictly to those percentages if applications didn't come in the way that we were expecting. So.
Great, thank you.
Good. All right, so on the I think we can go to the next slide. So upcoming meetings, as I mentioned before, we are likely going to have a meeting in February, at least something prior to March 15th, when the Department of Revenue direction is needed on the fee increases potentially for inflation. At that meeting, we hope to bring you that final decision on the equity and the match. We may also be able to bring a recommended decision on data reporting. It sounds like we had a lot of consistency in what we were talking about on that, so we can present that as well next month. We don't want to rush you into that decision, but it might also give us the opportunity to to take a couple months off from meeting if we make that decision in February as well. So we can present a couple options on that based on the discussion today. And then next slide is just our typical, here's our website. You can subscribe for updates. Keep an eye on this for all the latest and greatest information. And thank everyone for their time today. And if someone from the board can make a motion to adjourn, unless there's other questions. Director Garcia.
Thank you. I just wanted to, if you could go back to one slide there. I just wanted to comment that the annual report I thought was excellent. You did a great job, all of you. And I don't see it here on this this page, but maybe having access to that report would be helpful for anyone visiting our website. Good job on the report.
That's a great suggestion. We'll make sure we put it in the resources section for sure. Any other questions or comments? All right, and I do need a board member to adjourn the meeting.
So moved.
All in favor?
Aye.
All right.
Aye.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. We will be in touch about next meeting.
Bye-bye. Thanks.
Thank you.